Hello and welcome to Accountancy Insights. I'm Guy Ruddle, stepping slightly nervously into Philippa's shoes as she's away this week for a special episode dissecting all the announcements in the autumn statement and the likely impacts on business and the economy.
From the moment she stood up, she was basically sending out this message that, yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm not spinning this, and this is absolutely something I'm not in the slightest bit ashamed of.
Business was almost an afterthought. In the previous budget, it was very clear, wanted a big increase in taxes, and that would be paid for by business. Whether she was scarred by that, she didn't come a second time for business.
Given the long lead time in, I was expecting that there would be some other policies out there, and they didn't materialise. And I find that slightly strange because they did have a very long time to think about this.
The usual economic dream team is joining me today. Francis Haque, Chief Economist at Santander, and Iain Wright, ICAEW's Chief Policy and Communications Officer, are in the studio. And we'll be getting the thoughts of David Williamson, Chief Political Commentator for The Express. Iain, Francis, welcome to the studio again. Look after me, won't you? How are you both?
Very good, thank you.
Good,
we'll
thanks.
look after you.
Excellent. Well, I feel in safe hands. I think we've got to start with the drama of the whole thing with the budget, with the accidental pre-release of all the major budget details by the OBR, putting a link on their website before Rachel Reeves had even stood up. As I say, David Williamson was our man in the room, in the chamber of the House of Commons when it was all going on. So I went over to Westminster and I asked him what it was like.
It was extraordinary. People were saying they hadn't seen the House of Commons so febrile in years. And it was one of those moments where it's just sheer human drama, because you see on the Tory benches, the Shadow Chancellor, Sir Mel Stride, he's sitting there scribbling frantically as he's getting to actually write a proper budget response rather than, hoping to wing things. You've got Andrew Griffith, the Shadow Business Secretary, leaning across. You've got Kemi in the middle. It was extraordinary. And then you've got a very unimpressed looking Prime Minister and Chancellor immediately opposite them. So it was intense human drama. But it also perhaps was just the sense that you get in Britain so often of, oh no, something's gone wrong. Which wasn't how the Chancellor wanted to set the scene, but perhaps in a way it did get a lot of the most controversial things out of it. So from the moment she stood up, she was basically sending out this message that, yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm not spinning this, and this is absolutely something I'm not in the slightest bit ashamed of. And it was a very forthright delivery, which it was a true House of Commons moment.
It's all good knockabout stuff, but is there a sort of more important element to this? Because there's so much sort of pre-leaking of things this time around, to the extent that the Deputy Speaker had a go at Rachel Reeves and previous Chancellors for how much leaking there is before a budget. And I remember the days when nothing was leaked in. So do you think that for the business community, at least, there is a more important element to this?
I think you need to take the two things separately. The OBR leak was appalling. It was embarrassing. It will be mortifying for the OBR. But actually, in the overall scheme of things, it didn't change matters. Markets did not move. People did not do a sort of insider trading element as a result of this because of new information. What I take more seriously is from September onwards, this flying of kites. Are we going to increase income tax? Are we going to break the manifesto pledge? What about an exit tax? What about a wealth tax? What do we need to be doing about a whole range of things like, I don't know, NICs, national insurance contributions on LLPs? That freezes business confidence. We cannot let this happen. This is no way to produce the tax and spending plans of a major economic power. And so I think it really is a terrible thing for business investment. We have to revolutionise the way that we look at the run-up to a budget, how business and other stakeholders are consulted, and then what the Chancellor does. One of the things we've been saying, Guy, in terms of ICAEW is our members tell us, amongst other things, business is too uncertain. Since people returned from summer holidays this year, it's been really uncertain, largely because of all this speculation.
And Francis, do you think it was sort of particularly bad this time? I mean, it's not like it's a new phenomenon.
No, it was particularly bad this time. I mean, I think I wrote a note must have been a few weeks in that sort of had, it ran on for pages as to what the different, lots of different things that they'd come out with, different initiatives, different policy actions. Even then, it wasn't the end of it. And, to the point that Iain's made on, business confidence. And it's also affected the housing market because obviously all the talk about mansion tax or what was happening with council tax and all this possible even removing of capital gains from those at the top end, it really didn't help the housing market either.
Well, so that's the sort of the drama and the packaging of the whole thing. But what about the actual content of the budget? Let's go back to David Williamson for his thoughts.
What's immediately clear is that there are now great dividing lines in British politics. Do you remember it wasn't that long ago people were always talking about, the apathy is such a problem and all the parties are the same. How do you decide to choose between them? Well, that's no longer a problem. The great British voter, the next time they go into the supermarket of democracy that is the polling booth, are going to have a smorgasbord to choose from, which you would need to go to a very fine deli to find anything like that.
Who do you think she was talking to with the budget?
Yeah, this is the key criticism of her budget, is that she was essentially talking to two groups. One is the people out there in the bond markets. The second are the people who are sitting immediately behind her, the Labour backbench MPs. And what about the actual country? And have everybody else essentially being frozen out of the discussion. Now, she will vehemently say that's not the case, and she'll point to things like frozen rail fares, frozen prescription charges, help with energy bills. But there is this sense that this was a budget which was designed to pacify two groups which threaten her personal electoral survival and that of Keir Starmer as well.
And do you think, if it was her objective, has she succeeded?
Well, the market reaction was very muted in the immediate aftermath, which she'd probably, in these days, chalk up as a bit of a win, that she hasn't caused panic to any great degree. And certainly the Labour MPs who were very keen to see the two child's benefit cap scraps, they were waving their order papers in true theatrical House of Commons fashion. And that's something which you actually don't see that much. The days of a noisy backbenchers, things have been a little more muted this Parliament, but this was the moment where suddenly they were roaring. However, there's a bit of nervousness about this as well, because there was polling at the start of the week that showed even among people who voted Labour in 2024, there's actually pretty broad support for the benefit cap. And she knows that she's in a difficult position if the narrative that goes out, which is going out, is that your taxes are going up to fund benefits and that it's actually hardworking people who are being squeezed. And that is what certainly the Conservatives and Reform are going to be pushing relentlessly.
So that's a sort of political viewpoint on the budget. Francis, from an economic viewpoint, what did you think overall?
Well, if I'm totally honest, I was a little underwhelmed. And that was because of the lack of growth measures that were in there. And I think, that's been picked up today by newspapers. I mean, what's the resistance? It could have been worse, I think, has been the most commonly used phrase, which... I mean, that's not necessarily what you want to hear. But, in fairness, the markets haven't reacted badly. And obviously her backbenchers seem to be happy. So from that perspective, a win maybe for her. I do wonder how MPs are going to fare when they go back to their... they go back to their constituencies and people are asking. And the reason for that is partly because... Actually, if you look at, how the tax burden will be placed, it really will sit with middle income very much because of the thresholds being frozen, and it will bring more and more people in. So from that perspective, that may not go down so well. But at least for now, everything was, the markets are at least calm. That's a good thing.
And Iain, are you slightly more sanguine about the content than the way it was delivered?
Business was almost an afterthought in the budget. In the previous budget, in Rachel Reeves's first budget last year, it was very clear, wanted a big increase in taxes, and that would be paid for by business. Whether she was scarred by that, she didn't come a second time for business. And I suppose in Francis's words, it could have been worse in that regard. But in terms of a government that has growth as its number one mission, there was very little in the way of growth measures. There were a few things, it wasn't just black and white in that regard, some exemption stuff with regards to SDLR for capital listings in the UK. That was a good thing. I'm a big fan of EIS, the initiative to encourage investment. That's been a long-standing feature. That's probably why it's been such a success. It's been a long-standing feature for many, many years. That's been expanded and doubled. That's a great thing. But in terms of things that will move the dial to raise the growth rate and, importantly, to raise the productivity performance of our country, not much there, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've both picked up on the growth story, because when I talked to David earlier, he did the same.
It was fascinating in the immediate response to the budget. One, I think it was the Tony Blair Institute, came out with the line that what we need now is a plan for growth. Now, that would be quietly quite damning, because the rhetoric from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer from day one has been that they have a plan for growth, that this is what this government is all about. And to say that you need to have one, that's basically an admission that this budget hasn't been a plan for growth. So whether we now start to see something dramatic on things like house building, where there's so much worry that there simply aren't enough people in the construction sector, that so many brickies are coming up to retirement. There's all these things. And the endless question of, well, it's great that rail fares are frozen, but can we actually build the lines that are promised? Can we actually do this? And there's that question which is just nagging, and it saps confidence, both consumer confidence and investor confidence. Is Britain a place where you can get things built?
The sort of fundamental thing about growth is productivity, right? And that's, Francis, been downgraded from 1.3% to 1.1%. How big a problem is that, do you think?
That's an issue in terms of what your growth outlook then looks like. Although I will say that actually the OBR's forecasts, looking forward, don't worry so much about what it is for this year, but looking forward is actually more aligned to actually what external forecasters already have. So I think from our perspective, it's more in line, with what we expect to see going forward. But obviously that's because we never had such strong productivity rates in there. So, not great from for Labour's point of view that we've had the downgrade. But what's more concerning is that, the OBR weren't suggesting that at any point it was going to be uplifted, which is really what we need to see. So, and that goes back to this point about the fact that they said there were no measures to look at, because there were no growth measures in the budget. So, it is definitely an issue, and it will be for them going forward, because the only way out of this is to grow. Otherwise, we're going to constantly be coming back for more.
I would really agree with that. Without exaggerating too much, productivity is everything. How much unit of output you can squeeze from a unit of input and making it better is the key to rising living standards, ultimate wage growth that is sustainable, and economic growth. And we haven't had that since the 2008 global financial crash. We're not alone in that. Other Western European nations have had it too. But is it a big concern that, in order to people are grumpy. The Chancellor acknowledged yesterday people are angry. And they're angry because they feel like their living standards haven't risen for quite some time. But the only way we can do that is by focusing on productivity.
What, in that area specifically, could she have done, do you think?
She could have made it a budget for business investment to say, we're going to give the conditions. She could make things simpler. In particular, what was really striking is, and I think successive governments are doing this, the notion of better tax simplification. Just make the tax system simpler, easier to comply with. Some of my members might not agree with that, because they might say, hang on, I can give advice by giving that advice to, in terms of a complex tax system. But, our members are generally going, it's too complex. It's getting ever more complicated. The tax code is something like, 23,000 pages long? This is ridiculous, and getting longer by the year. So bold tax reform on things like business rates and investment could have really helped. And you can only really do that in the front half of a parliament. So now we're getting towards the middle of the parliament. It's not going to happen. But I don't think any government of any political persuasion in recent years have really had the appetite for that.
Our sister podcast, The Tax Track, is going to be obviously looking at the detail of the tax measures in the budget. So you should go and listen to that as well. But sort of at a higher level, aside from the sort of more fundamental reform of the tax system, the actual tax measures that came in, was there anything that sort of struck either of you as particularly good or bad, do you think?
Good.
Well, what about, so because some of those measures are sort of, you say it was a bit of a dull budget. Some of those measures were quite significant. Thresholds freezing for another 3 years. So that's right out to, 2031. I mean, that's a long time.
And that's a long-standing feature. I can't see a government in, recent years and in the future changing that, so more people will pay more tax. It's interesting that, in terms of the model of yesterday's budget, the Chancellor was very clear that, we're going to have another big tax increase and that will be paid for by individuals, more or less. Yeah. So the big feature is the thresholds and the freezing for another 3 years. The other thing which surprised me, though, Guy, was, all the trailing on salary sacrifice for pensions. But that doesn't come in till April 2029. So what will happen? How will people redesign their remuneration in terms of salary, pensions, any sort of tax relief on the back of that? There's a long time to think about that. Whether people say, I demand a pay increase, I demand that you pay as an employer national insurance on this for me. I don't know how it'll work, but there's a long time before it comes in.
I think that's partly because businesses were worried about how quickly they'd have to turn it around, because certainly to do it in less than 6 months, if it came in, for example, in April, would almost have been impossible, I think. So they've obviously taken note of that. But I was slightly surprised that it was 2029 for when it starts. But I suppose it gives them time to think about what they could do. I mean, for me, actually, one of the things was it was interesting to see that they did go ahead with the electric vehicles levy and things like that. I mean, I think this has been talked about sort of before, about the fact that we are getting to a point where if more electric vehicles coming through, that means less petrol, so less fuel duty and all the rest of it. So I don't know how that will land particularly, but I think that the fact that they've actually made a start on it probably is at least a good thing from that perspective.
I think the electric vehicles tax thing is an interesting point about that wider, do we have tax reform? So, petrol and diesel engines are in some degree of slow decline. So how do you raise money from vehicles? But having a more comprehensive, simpler tax system based upon that, whether it could be, and this is politically very contentious, well, why don't we pay per mile? The more miles you do, the more you pay in tax, all of that. But having something to think about, that tax reform, tinkering again doesn't help, and doing one thing that might affect maybe a growth area of this country. I come from the northeast. I'm proud that Nissan is the most productive car factory anywhere in Europe. It's brilliant. And their electric vehicles are fantastic and potentially really export-led. It can help us. This is a growth sector as part of our industrial strategy. But what impact will this have? Will people go, I won't buy an electric vehicle now? Because I used to quite like, the fact that I didn't have to pay any sort of fuel duty or tax on it. So just thinking about things in a holistic manner, this is a good example about, have you looked at the short term rather than the wider, longer term view?
And the fact that it's not being brought into until 2029, Francis, was there a sense that quite a lot of other things were sort of kicking the can down the road in this budget as well?
Well, I mean, I think there is that, given how late all the tax rises come in. I would also say that the one thing that actually I found interesting was the OBR didn't mention anything about, obviously, the employment rights bill. So there was nothing in there. So, which I thought was slightly strange, given we know that that's going to be a cost to businesses as well. So I don't know whether maybe some of the delay is also to do with that, in terms of how that might land. Obviously, that's to do with the salary sacrifice scheme. So, yeah, but I mean, all in all, there was that view of we've got a bit more spending up front and we'll just tax towards the end. And obviously, everyone goes, well, are you going to tax towards the end? Because obviously 2029 is, of course, election year.
Yeah, it's kind of the wrong way round, isn't it?
It completely defies political convention. Do the difficult decisions in the first 18 months of a parliament and then start to give away towards the end. We haven't got that this time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, just looking specifically at business and, and measures that are likely to impact business. We've talked about the salary sacrifice limit at £2,000 quite a lot. Do we care a lot about the tax exemption on low value imported goods going? Does that really matter an awful lot? I know it's quite a complicated thing to bring in, but quite a lot of sort of smaller businesses, of UK businesses, have been saying that it's you're competing against imported goods through Amazon or whatever, which aren't paying the same tax rates.
I'm never a fan of protectionist measures. In terms of free trade is always a great thing, but I think there's a fair point in terms of, is there any way that we could shield, is probably the wrong word, but shield our domestic businesses in the face of cheap imports in this regard. So that could be a positive step. And
one thing that doesn't seem to have got many headlines is sort of a 2% increase on the tax rate on dividends, which, for lots of businesses which are, one-man bands or slightly, small businesses, quite a lot of them pay a lot of their income to themselves out of dividends rather than salary. It's quite a big tax rise for them, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. And it's also not just on dividends. We're talking savings and, of course, property as well here. And obviously, a lot of people will have noticed that the threshold for ISA cash, the cash ISA has dropped, but you have got, greater tax on savings. So if you want to keep them in cash, that's also a bit of an issue. But yeah, the dividends, I think, is a fair point.
My sense, I don't know whether there's a sort of plan in the Treasury for this, but it looks, on the basis of two budgets from the Chancellor, that she's quite keen to get her tax take from income tax, national insurance contributions. It was striking that the other biggie, VAT, wasn't really a feature of this budget, but in terms of trying to push behaviour towards income tax, and maybe the dividend tax changes and savings tax changes, a bit of that. There may be an element of a feeling that taxation of property is somewhat light in this country relative to international peers, and therefore squeezing that a bit more. That could be a feature of subsequent budgets, perhaps. But I definitely think dividend taxes doesn't help the small business in that regard. The other thing I would mention, full expensing of capital allowances is a great thing. Hopefully that's a permanent feature to boost business investment. But for those elements where you don't get full expensing, the decrease of writing down allowances is going to impact adversely on business investment. That was a bad sign.
And Iain, were there specific asks that the ICAEW had of this budget? And if so, were they met?
The big one was concentrate on growth.
So no.
The other things, and I sort of alluded to this in my first answer, was businesses are telling us constantly it's too expensive to do business, it's too complicated to do business, and it's too uncertain to do business. So those measures such as simplification of tax, business rate reform to make sure that you're not penalised for wanting to invest in new assets, plant and machinery and location, that sort of thing. So in that regard, as I said, given that business was a bit of an afterthought in this budget, could have done a lot more in terms of that growth element and our ask and our members' asks.
Do we overall then sort of mark this as a bit of a missed opportunity?
I would say so. I mean, given the long lead time in, I was expecting that there would be some other, policies out there. I mean, we weren't just talking about tax raising here, and they didn't materialise. And I find that slightly strange because they did have a very long time to think about this.
I mean, we've talked a bit about tax reform. By the way, on tax reform, yes, I know. I think everybody in this room, and I think most places would think, yeah, let's simplify the tax code. But I mean, I know you jokingly said that the ICAEW members probably wouldn't want it too simplified. But the group of people that never want to simplify the tax code are politicians, because the more complex it is, they're always looking for levers, right? They want to pull levers that have a small effect in one area. And so you're never going to simplify a tax system if you are going to lose some of your levers if you do that, right?
But you just tweak, and the constant tweaking means, you're building a little bit and then a little bit and a little bit. And then within quite a short period of time, you realise that this is just mushroomed. And you think, I'm not sure this is working. No one has ever stood back and said, so what do we want to do about this? And actually, let's be honest, and again, I've mentioned this earlier, the three biggies, the really big things that move the dial on tax are income tax, national insurance contributions and VAT. Everything else is sort of very insubstantial. They're the big ones. They're never going to be changed that much. But it's a case of, why don't we look afresh about how we tax in the modern era to make sure that, this is fair, certainly, but an open, innovative and ultimately improving productivity economy.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Francis. Would, as an economist, would a simplified tax code improve productivity, do you think?
Yes, I think it would, particularly for businesses, because I think they have a better idea about what to expect, and also for households as well, so they know what's the best thing to do with the money we've got. I'm always going to have income tax, of course, but, what's left over at the end? How do I best make the most of this? And I'd also say that has implications for, moving forward as, the world ages and, we've got more and more pressure coming actually on the fiscal position. You want people to be saving more because that will help in the future. So, in that respect, I think, it has two implications. One is it will help businesses, I think, to be able to understand better where to invest their money. And two, I think it would also help households to be able to understand that better.
And it incentivises good behaviour. You want to make it simple, but if you have simple rates, one of the dangers, one of the risks, and we see this, is you have cliff edges and people go, I don't want to go over that edge. It's not worth my while to take that new job or to get that pay increase. And, you go into the higher rate at 50,250, I think it is, and it's been like that for some time. And people might say, I don't want that promotion. Similarly, people say if you go from 100,000 to 125,000, people go, no, it's not worth my while. So how do you encourage people to take that new job, to get that promotion, to be upskilled, to be more marketable in the job market? That's how productivity will improve. You've got to inspire and aspire people to want to grow, to want to improve. And I'm not sure the tax system does that. That's not the individual fault of Rachel Reeves. This goes back a generation, successive governments, successive chancellors. But how do we lift and aspire? That's the key.
Well, that's a great place to... Well, we could try and answer that, of course, but that would take us another...
series of
podcasts. A whole series, whole series of podcasts. So I think we'll call it a day there and leave it there for now. Can I thank both of you for looking after me so well? It's not about me, but I've really enjoyed sharing a studio with you. And you two will be back with Philippa, thank heavens, I can hear everyone saying, for the in January for the 2026 look ahead. Are we there already? We're pretty close to there already. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Join us for the next Behind the Numbers episode in a couple of weeks, where Philippa will be back to discuss the collapse of the crypto network Celsius, what it tells us about the actual stability of these coins and how regulators are addressing the risks. And be sure to go deeper into the tax proposals in this budget with the Tax Track episode, where the team has been poring over the details of every proposal. Don't forget to log this podcast as CPD on the ICAEW website. And if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll be able to log every single episode you listen to as CPD as well, including the back catalogue. Thank you for being with us.